Chapter 4. It is the records of the French Academy that, upon March 17th, 1669, in the town of Chatillon-sur-Seine, fell a reddish substance that was thick, viscous, and putrid. American Journal of Science 1-41 404. Story of a highly unpleasant substance that had fallen from the sky in Wilson County, Tennessee. Read that Dr. Troost visited the place and investigated. Later, we're going to investigate some investigations. But never mind that now. Dr. Troost reported that the substance was clear blood and portions of flesh scattered upon tobacco fields. He argued that a whirlwind might have taken an animal up from one place, mauled it around, and have precipitated its remains somewhere else. But in volume 44, page 216 of the journal, there is an apology. The whole matter is, upon newspaper authority, said to have been a hoax by Negroes who had pretended to have seen the shower for the sake of practicing upon the credulity of their masters, that they had scattered the decaying flesh of a dead hog over the tobacco fields. If we don't accept this datum, at least we see the sociologically necessary determination to have all falls accredited to earthly origins, even when they're falls that don't fall. Annual Register 1821-687. That upon the 13th of August, 1819, something had fallen from the sky in Amherst, Massachusetts. It had been examined and described by Professor Graves, formerly lecturer at Dartmouth College. It was an object that had upon it a nap similar to that of a milled cloth. Upon removing this nap, a buff-colored, pulpy substance was found. It had an offensive odor and, upon exposure to the air, turned into a vivid red. This thing was said to have fallen with a brilliant light. Also see the Edinburgh Philosophical Journal 5-295. In the Annals of Chimie 1821-67. Mr. Argo accepts the datum and gives 4 instances of similar objects or substances said to have fallen from the sky, 2 of which we shall have with our data of gelatinous or viscous matter, and 2 of which I omit because it seems to me that the dates given are too far back. In the American Journal of Science 1-2-335 is Professor Graves' account communicated by Professor Dewey. That upon the evening of August 13th, 1819, a light was seen in Amherst, a falling object, sound as if of an explosion. In the home of Professor Dewey, this light was reflected upon a wall of a room in which were several members of Professor Dewey's family. The next morning, in Professor Dewey's front yard, in what is said to have been the only position from which the light that had been seen in the room the night before could have been reflected, was found a substance unlike anything before observed by anyone who saw it. It was a bowl-shaped object, about 8 inches in diameter and 1 inch thick, bright buff-colored and having upon it a fine nap. Upon removing this covering, a buff-colored pulpy substance of the consistency of soft soap was found, of an offensive, suffocating smell. A few minutes of exposure to the air changed the buff color to a livid color resembling venous blood. It absorbed moisture quickly from the air and liquefied. For some of the chemic reactions, see the journal. There's another lost quasi-soul of datum that seems to me to belong here. London Times, April 19th, 1836. Fall of fish that have occurred in the neighborhood of Allahabad, India. It is said that the fish were of the Kalawa species, which are about a span in length and a seer in weight, They were dead and dry, or they had been such a long time out of the water that we can't accept that they had been scooped out of the pond by a whirlwind, even though they were so definitely identified as of a known local species, or they were not fish at all. Incline myself to the acceptance that they were not fish, but slender fish-shaped objects of the same substance as that which fell in Amherst. It is said that whatever they were, they could not be eaten, that in the pan they turned to blood. For details of this story, see the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, 1834 307. May 16th or 17th, 1834 is the given date in the journal. In the American Journal of Science, 1 25 362, occurs the inevitable damnation of the Amherst object. Professor Edward Hitchcock went to live in Amherst. He says that years later, another object, like the one said to have fallen in 1819, had been found at nearly the same place. Professor Hitchcock was invited by Professor Graves to examine it. Exactly like the first one, corresponded in size and color and consistency. The chemical reactions were the same. Professor Hitchcock recognized it in a moment. It was a gelatinous fungus. He did not satisfy himself as to just the exact species it belonged to, but he predicted that similar fungi might spring up within 24 hours. But before evening, 2 others sprang up. Or we've arrived at one of the oldest of the exclusionist conventions, or Gnostic. We shall have many data of gelatinous substance said to have fallen from the sky. Almost always the exclusionists argue that it was only nostoc, an algae, or in some respects a fungus growth. The rival convention is spawn of frogs or fishes. These two conventions have made a strong combination. In instances where testimony was not convincing that gelatinous matter had been seen to fall, it was said that the gelatinous substance was Gnostic, Nostoc, and had been upon the ground in the first place. When the testimony was too good that it had fallen, it was said to be spawn that had been carried from one place to another in a whirlwind. Now, I can't say that the nostoc is always greenish any more than I can say that the blackbirds are always black, having seen a white one. We shall quote a scientist who knew of flesh-colored nostoc when so to know was convenient. When we come to reported falls of gelatinous substances, I'd like it to be noticed how often they are described as whitish or grayish. In looking up the subject myself, I have read only of greenish nostoc, said to be greenish in Webster's Dictionary, said to be blue-green in the New International Encyclopedia, from bright green to olive green. Science Gossip 10-114, green. Science Gossip 7-260, greenish. Notes and Queries 1-11-219. It would seem acceptable that, if many reports of white birds should occur, the birds are not blackbirds, even though there have been white blackbirds, or that, if often reported, grayish or whitish gelatinous substance is not Gnostic, and is not spawn if occurring in times unseasonable for spawn. The Kentucky phenomenon. So it was called in this day, and now we have an occurrence that attracted a great deal of attention in its own time. Usually these things of the accursed have been hushed up or disregarded, suppressed like the 7 black rains of Slains, but upon March 3rd, 1876, something occurred in Bath City, Kentucky, that brought many newspaper correspondents to the scene. The substance that looked like beef that fell from the sky. Upon March 3rd, 1876, at Olympian Springs, Bath County, Kentucky, flakes of the substance that looked like beef fell from the sky, from a clear sky. We'd like to emphasize that it was said that nothing but this falling substance was visible in the sky. It fell in flakes of various sizes, some 2 inches square, 1, 3, or 4 inches square. The flake formation is interesting. Later we shall think of it as signifying pressure somewhere. It was a thick shower on the ground, on trees, on fences, but it was narrowly localized, or upon a strip of land about 100 yards long and about 50 yards wide. For the first account, see the Scientific American 34-197 and the New York Times, March 10th, 1876. Then the exclusionists. Something that looked like beef, 1 flake of it the size of a quarter envelope. If we think of how hard the exclusionists have fought to reject the coming of ordinary looking dust from this Earth's externality, we can sympathize with them in the sensational instance, perhaps. Newspaper correspondents wrote broadcast and witness were quoted, and this time there is no mention of a hoax, and except by one scientist, there is no denial that the fall did take place. It seems to me that the exclusionists are still more emphatically conservators. It is not so much that they are inimical to all data, internally derived substances that fall upon this earth, as that they are inimical to all data discordant with a system that does not include such phenomena, or the spirit or hope or ambition of the cosmos, which we call attempted positivism, not to find out the new, not to add to what is called knowledge, but to systematize. Scientific American, Supplement 2-426. That the substance reported from Kentucky had been examined by Leopold Brandis. At last, we have a proper explanation of this much talked of phenomenon. It has been comparatively easy to identify the substance and to fix its status. The Kentucky wonder is no more or less than Gnostic, or that it had not fallen, that it had been upon the ground in the first place, and had swollen in rain, and attracting attention by greatly increased volume, had been supposed by unscientific observers to have fallen in rain. What rain, I don't know. Also, it is spoken of as dried several times. That's one of the most important of the details. But the relief of outraged propriety expressed in the supplement is amusing to some of us who, I fear, may be a little improper at times. Very spirit of the Salvation Army, when some third-rate scientist comes out with an explanation of the vermiform appendix or the os coccygeus that would have been acceptable to Moses. To give completeness to the proper explanation, it is said that Mr. Brandis had identified the substance as flesh-colored Gnostic. Professor Lawrence Smith of Kentucky, one of the most resolute of the exclusionists, New York Times, March 12, 1876, that the substance had been examined and analyzed by Professor Smith, according to whom it gave every indication of being the dried spawn of some reptile, doubtless of the frog, or up from one place and down in another. As to dried, that may refer to condition when Professor Smith received it. In the Scientific American Supplement 2-473, Dr. A. Mead Edwards, president of the Newark Scientific Association, writes that when he saw Mr. Brandis' communication, his feeling was of conviction that propriety had been reestablished, or that the problem had been solved, as he expresses it. Knowing Mr. Brandis well, he had called upon the upholder of respectability to see the substance that had been identified as Gnostic. But he had also called upon Dr. Hamilton, who had a specimen, and Dr. Hamilton had declared it to be lung tissue. Dr. Edwards writes of the substance that had so completely or beautifully, if beauty is completeness, been identified as Gnostic. It turned out to be lung tissue also. He wrote to other persons who had specimens and identified other specimens as masses of cartilage or muscle fibers. As to whence it came, I have no theory. Nevertheless, he endorses the local explanation, and a bizarre thing it is. Flock of gorged, heavy-weighted buzzards, but far up, invisible in the clear sky. They had disgorged. Professor Fasig lists the substance in his bibliography as fish spawn. McGatty, Monthly Weather Review, May 1918, lists it as a jelly-like material supposed to have been the dried spawn either of fishes or of some batrachian. Or this is why, against the seemingly unsuperable odds, against all things new, there can be what is called progress. that nothing is positive in the aspects of homogeneity and unity. The whole world should seem to combine against you. It is only unreal combination or intermediateness to unity and disunity. Every resistance itself every resistance itself is itself divided into parts resisting one another. The simplest strategy seems to be never bother to fight a thing, set its own parts fighting one another. We are merging away from carnal and gelatinous substance, and here is an abundance of instances or reports of instances. These data are so improper they're obscene to the science of today. But we shall see that science, before it becomes so rigorous, was not so prudish. Clondani was not, and Gregg was not. I shall have to accept myself that gelatinous substance has often fallen from the sky, or that far up or far away the whole sky is gelatinous. That meteors tear through and detach fragments, that fragments are brought down by storms, that the twinkling of stars is penetration of light through something that quivers. I think myself that it would be absurd to say that the whole sky is gelatinous. It seems more acceptable that only certain areas are. Humboldt, Cosmos 1-119, says that all our data in this respect must be classed amongst the mythical fables of mythology. He is very sure, but just a little redundant. We shall be oppressed by the standard resistances. There, in the first place, up from one place in a whirlwind and down in another. We shall not bother to be very convincing one way or another, because of the overshadowing of the datum with which we shall end up. It will mean that something had been in a stationary position for several days over a small part of a small town in England. This is a revolutionary thing that we had alluded to before. Whether the substance was Gnostic or spawn or some kind of larval nexus doesn't matter so much. If it stood in the sky for several days, we rank with Moses as a chronicler of improprieties, or was that story or datum we mean told by Moses? Then we shall have so many records of gelatinous substance said to have fallen with meteorites that, between the two phenomena, some of us will have to accept connection, or that there are at least vast gelatinous areas aloft and that meteorites tear through, carrying down some of the substance. Comptes Rendus 3-554. That in 1836, M. Vallot, member of the French Academy, placed before the Academy some fragments of a gelatinous substance, said to have fallen from the sky, and asked that they be analyzed. There is no further allusion to this subject. Comptes Rendus 23-542. That in Wilna, Lithuania, April 4th, 1846, in a rainstorm, fell nut-sized masses of substance that is described as both resinous and gelatinous. It was odorless until burned. Then it spread a very pronounced sweetish odor. It is described as like gelatin, but much firmer. But, having been in water 24 hours, it swelled out and looked altogether gelatinous. It was grayish. We are told that in 1841 and 1846, a similar substance had fallen in Asia Minor. In Notes and Queries 8-6-190, it is said that early in August 1894, thousands of jellyfish, about the size of a shilling, had fallen at Bath, England. I think it is not acceptable that they were jellyfish, but it does look as if this time frog spawn did fall from the sky and may have been translated by a whirlwind, because at the same time small frogs fell at Wigan, England. Nature 8710. That June 24th, 1911, at Eton Bucks, England, the ground was found covered with masses of jelly the size of peas after a heavy rainfall. We are not told of Gnostic this time. It is said that the object contained numerous eggs of some species of Chironomus, from which larvae soon emerged. I incline then to think that the objects fell at Bath were neither jellyfish nor masses of frog spawn, but something of a larval kind. This is what had occurred at Bath, England 23 years before. London Times, April 24th, 1871. That upon the 22nd of April, 1871, a storm of gelatinous drops, neither jellyfish nor masses of frog spawn, but something of a line missing here in the original text, railroad station at Bath. Many soon developed into a worm-like crystallis about an inch in length. The account of this occurrence in the Zoologist 2-6-26806 is more like the Eaton datum of minute forms said to have been Enfrosia, not forms about an inch in length. Trans Ent Soc of London, 1871 Proc XXII. That the phenomenon has been investigated by Reverend L. Jennings of Bath. His description is of minute worms in flimsy envelopes. He tries to account for their segregation. The mystery of it is what could have brought so many of them together. Many other falls we shall have record of, and in most of them, segregation is the great mystery. A whirlwind seems anything but a segregative force. Segregation of things that have fallen from the sky has been avoided as most deep-eyed of the damned. Mr. Jennings conceives of a large pool in which were many of these spherical masses, of the pool drying up and concentrating all in a small area, of a whirlwind and scooping all up together. But several days later, more of these objects fell in the same place. That such marksmanship is not attributable to whirlwinds seems to me to be what we think we mean by common sense. It may not look like common sense to say that these things had been stationary over the town of Bath several days. The 7 black rains of Slains, the 4 red rains of Siena. An interesting sidelight on the mechanics of orthodoxy is that Mr. Jennings dutifully records the second fall, but ignores it in his explanation. R.P. Gregg, one of the most notable of catalogers of meteoric phenomena, records Phil Mag 4-8-463 falls of viscid substance in the years 1652, 1686, 1718, 1796, 1811, 1819, 1844. He gives earlier dates, but I practice exclusions myself. In the report of the British Association, 1860 to 63, Gregg records a meteor that seemed to pass near the ground between Barsdorf and Freiburg, Germany. The next day, a jelly-like mass was found in the snow. Unseasonableness for either spawn or Gnostic. Gregg's comment in this instance is curious if true, but he records without modification the fall of a meteorite in Gotha, Germany, September 6, 1835, leaving a jelly-like mass on the ground. We are told that this substance fell only 3 feet away from an observer. In the report of the British Association, 1855 to 94, according to a letter from Gregg to Professor Baden-Powell at night, October 8, 1844, near Koblenz, a German who was known to Gregg and another person saw a luminous body fall close to them. They returned next morning and found a gelatinous mass of grayish color. According to Chaldani account, Annals of Philosophy, NS 12-94, a viscous mass fell with a luminous meteorite between Siena and Rome, May 1652. Viscous matter found after the fall of a fireball in Lusata, March 1796. Fall of a gelatinous substance after the explosion of a meteorite near Heidelberg, July 1811, in the Edinburgh Philosophical Journal 1-234. The substance that fell at Lusata is said to have been of the color and odor of dried brown varnish. In the American Journal of Science 1-26133, it is said that the gelatinous matter fell with a globe of fire upon the island of Lethe, India, 1718. in the American Journal of Science 1 26 396. In many observations upon the meteors of November 1833 are reports of falls of gelatinous substance that, according to the newspaper reports, lumps of jelly were found on the ground at Rahway, New Jersey. The substance was whitish or resembled the coagulated white of an egg. Mr. H. H. Garland of Nelson County, Virginia, had found a jelly like substance of about the circumference of a 25-cent piece. That, according to the communication from A.C. Twining to Professor Olmsted, a woman at West Point, New York, had seen a mass the size of a teacup. It looked like boiled starch. That, according to a newspaper of Newark, New Jersey, a mass of gelatinous substance like a soft soap had been found. It possessed little elasticity, and on the application of heat, it evaporated as readily as water. It seems incredible that a scientist would have such hardihood or infidelity as to accept that these things had fallen from the sky. Nevertheless, Professor Olmsted, who collected the lost souls, says the fact that the supposed deposits were so uniformly described as gelatinous substance forms a presumption in favor of the supposition that they had the origin ascribed to them. In contemporaneous scientific publications, considerable attention was given to Professor Olmsted's series of papers upon the subject of the November meteors. You will not find one mention of the part that treats of gelatinous matter.